Good afternoon. I know I've been away for a while, work and real life obligations and the like. So I know I've seen everybody around the tubes. I just wanted to do a real quick recording on an upcoming reading and discussion. It is Notes on Nationalism, George Orwell, some more Orwell stuff. Um, I, I think y'all have gathered that I kind of like the guy and his writing. So I'm going to read the introduction and see how everybody likes it. Let's see. Somewhere or other, Byron makes use of the French word longueur and remarks in passing that though in England we happen not to have the word, we have the thing in considerable profusion. In the same way, there is a habit of mind which is now so widespread that it affects the thinking on nearly every subject, but which has not yet been given a name. As the nearest existing equivalent, I have chosen the word nationalism. But it will be seen in a moment that I'm not using it in quite the ordinary sense, if only because the emotion I am speaking about does not always attach itself to what is called a nation, that is, a single race or geographical area can attach itself to a church or a class, or it may work in a merely negative sense against something or other without the need for any positive object of loyalty. By nationalism, I mean, first of all, the habit of assuming that human beings can be classified like insects and that whole blocks of millions or tens of millions of people can be confidently labeled good or bad. But secondly, and this is much more important, I mean the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, placing it beyond good and evil, and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. Nationalism is not to be confused with patriotism. Both words are normally used in so vague a way that any definition is liable to be challenged, but one must draw a distinction between them, since two different and even opposing ideas are involved. By patriotism, I mean devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world, but has no wish to force on other people. Patriotism is of its nature defensive, both militarily and culturally. Nationalism, on the other hand, is inseparable from the desire for power. The abiding purpose of every nationalist is to secure more power and more prestige, not for himself, but for the nation or other unit in which he has chosen to sink his own individuality, so long as it is applied merely to the more notorious and identifiable nationalist movement in Germany, Japan, and other countries. All of this is obvious enough. Confronted with a phenomenon like Nazism, which we can observe from the outside, nearly all of us would say much the same thing about it. But here I must repeat what I said above, that I am only using the word nationalism for lack of a better lack of a better. So that was the end of the sentence. Sorry, that messed me up a little bit. Nationalism, in the extended sense in which I am using the word, includes such movements and tendencies as communism, political Catholicism, Zionism, anti Semitism, Trotskyism, and pacifism. It does not necessarily mean loyalty to a government or a country, still less to one's own country, and it is not even strictly necessary that the units in which it deals should actually exist. To name a few obvious examples, Jewry, which I hate this word, but Islam, Christendom, and the proletariat and the white race are all of them objects of passionate nationalistic feeling. But their existence can be seriously questioned, and there is no definition of any one of them that would be universally accepted. It is also worth emphasizing once again that nationalist feeling can be purely negative. There are, for example, Trotskyists who have become simply enemies of the USSR without developing a corresponding loyalty to any other unit. When one grasps the implications of this, the nature of what I mean by nationalism becomes a good deal clearer. A nationalist is one who thinks solely or mainly in terms of competitive prestige. He may be a positive or negative nationalist. That is, he may use his mental energy either in boosting or denigrating. But at any rate, his thoughts always turn on victories, defeats, triumphs, and humiliations. He sees history, especially contemporary history, as the endless rise and decline of great power units. And every event that happens seems to him a demonstration that his own side is on the upgrade and some hated rival is on the downgrade. But finally, it is important not to confuse nationalism with mere worship of success. The nationalist does not go on the principle of simply ganging up with the strongest side. On the contrary, having picked his side, he persuades himself that it is the strongest and is able to stick to his belief even when the facts are overwhelmingly against him. Nationalism is power hunger tempered by self deception. Every nationalist is capable of the most flagrant dishonesty, but he is also, since he is conscious of serving something bigger than himself, unshakably certain of being in the right. Now that I have given this lengthy definition, I think it will be admitted that the habit of mind I am talking about is widespread among the English intelligentsia, and more widespread there than among the mass of the people. For those who feel deeply about contemporary politics, certain topics have become so infected by the considerations of prestige that a genuinely rational approach to them is almost impossible. Out of the hundreds of examples that one might choose, take this question. Which of the three great allies, the USSR, Britain, and the USA, have contributed most to the defeat of Germany? In theory, it should be possible to give a reasoned, perhaps even a conclusive answer to this question. In practice, however, the necessary calculations cannot be made, because anyone likely to bother his head about such a question would inevitably see it in terms of competitive prestige. He would therefore start by deciding in favor of Russia, Britain, or America, as the case might be, and only after this would begin searching for arguments that seem to support his case. And there are whole strings of kindred questions to which you can only get an honest answer from someone who is indifferent to the whole subject involved and whose opinion on it is probably worthless in any case. Hence, partly the remarkable failure in our time of political and military prediction. It is curious to reflect that out of all the experts of all the schools, there was not a single one who was able to foresee so likely an event as the Russo German Pact of 1939. And when news of the pact broke, the most wildly divergent of it explanations of it were given and predictions were made, which were falsified almost immediately, being based in nearly every case not on a study of probabilities, but on a desire to make the USSR seem good or bad, strong or weak. Political or military commentators, like astrologers, can survive among almost any mistake because their more devoted followers do not look to them for an appraisal of the facts, but for the stimulation of nationalistic loyalties and aesthetic judgments, especially literary judgments, are often corrupted in the same way as political ones. It would be different for an Indian nationalist to enjoy reading Kipling or for a conservative to see merit in Mayakovsky. And there is always the temptation to claim that any book whose tendency one disagrees with must be a bad book from a literary point of view. People of strongly nationalistic outlook often perform this sleight of hand without being conscious of dishonesty. In England, if one simply considers the number of people involved, it is probable that the dominant form of nationalism is old-fashioned British jingoism. It is certain that this is still widespread and is much more so than most observers would have believed a dozen years ago. However, it is in this essay, I am concerned chiefly with the reactions of the intelligentsia, among whom jingoism and even patriotism of the old kind are almost dead, though they now seem to be reviving among a minority. Among the intelligentsia, it hardly needs saying that the dominant form of nationalism is communism. Using this word in a very loose sense to include not merely Communist Party members, but fellow travelers and Russophiles generally. A communist, for my purpose here, is one who looks upon the USSR as his fatherland and feels it is his duty to justify Russian policy and advance Russian interests at all costs. Obviously, such people abound in England today, and their direct and indirect influence is very great. But many other forms of nationalism also flourish, and it is not by noticing the points of resemblance between different and even seemingly opposed currents of thought that one can best get the matter into perspective. 10 or 20 years ago, the form of nationalism most closely corresponding to communism today was political Catholicism. Its most outstanding exponent, though, was perhaps an extreme case rather than a typical one, was G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton was a writer of considerable talent who chose to suppress both his sensibilities and his intellectual honesty. In the cause of the Roman Catholic propaganda, During the last 20 years or so of his life, his entire output was, in reality, an endless repetition of the same thing. Under its labored cleverness, as simple and boring as great is Diana of the Ephesians. Every book that he wrote, every paragraph, every sentence, every incident in every story, every scrap of dialogue had to demonstrate beyond possibility of mistake the superiority of the Catholic over the Protestant or the pagan. But Chesterton was not content to think of this superiority as merely intellectual or spiritual. It had to be translated into terms of national prestige and military power, which entailed an ignorant idealization of the Latin countries, especially France. Chesterton had not lived long in France, and his picture of it as a land of Catholic peasants, incessantly singing Marseillaise over glasses of red wine, had about as much relation to reality as Chin Chow has to everyday life in Baghdad. And with this went not only an erroneous estimation of French military power, both before and after 1914 to 18. He maintained that France by itself was stronger than Germany. But a silly, vulgar glorification of the actual process of war, Chesterton's battle poems such as Lepanto or the Ballad of St. Barbara makes the charge of the Light Brigade read like a pacifist tract. They are perhaps the most tawdry bits of bombast to be found in our language. The interesting thing is that had the romantic rubbish which he habitually wrote about France and the French army been written by somebody else about Britain and the British army, he would have been the first to jeer. In home politics, he was a little Englander, a true hater of jingoism and imperialism, and according to his lights, a true friend of democracy. Yet, when he looked outwards into the international field, he could forsake his principles without even noticing he was doing so. Thus, his almost mystical belief in the virtues of democracy did not prevent him from admiring Mussolini. Mussolini had destroyed the representative government and freedom of the press for which Chesterton had struggled so hard at home. But Mussolini was an Italian and had made Italy strong, and that settled the matter. Nor did Chesterton ever find a word to say about imperialism and the conquest of the colored races when they were practiced by Italians or Frenchmen. His hold on reality, his literary taste, and even to some extent his moral sense were dislocated as soon as his nationalistic loyalties were involved. Obviously, there are considerable resemblances between political Catholicism, as exemplified by Chesterton, and communism. So, there are between either of these, and for instance, Scottish nationalism, Zionism, anti Semitism, or Trotskyism. It would be an oversimplification to say that all forms of nationalism are the same, even in their mental atmosphere. But there are certain rules that hold good in all cases. The following are the principal characteristics of nationalist thought: obsession, As nearly as possible, no nationalist ever thinks, talks, or writes about anything except the superiority of his own power unit. It is difficult, if not impossible, for any nationalist to conceal his allegiance. The smallest slur upon his own unit or any implied praise of a rival organization fills him with uneasiness, which he can only relieve by making some sharp retort. If the chosen unit is an actual country, such as our Ireland or India, he will generally claim superiority for it, not only in military power and political virtue, but in art, literature, sport, structure of the language, the physical beauty of the inhabitants, and perhaps even in climate, scenery, and cooking. He will show great sensitiveness about such thing as the correct display of flags, relative size of headlines, and the order in which different countries are named. Nomenclature plays a very important part in nationalist thought. Countries which have won their independence or gone through a nationalist revolution usually change their names, and any country or other unit around which, sorry about the light, y'all, strong feelings revolve is likely to have several names, each of them carrying different implication. The two sides of the Spanish Civil War had between them 9 or 10 names, expressing different degrees of love and hatred. Some of these names, ergo patriots for Franco supporters, loyalists for government supporters, were frankly question begging, and there was no single one of them which the two rival factions could have agreed to use. All nationalists consider it a duty to spread their own language to the detriment of rival languages. And among English speakers, this struggle reappears in subtler form as a struggle between dialects. Anglophobe Americans will refuse to use a slang phrase if they know it to be of British origin, and the conflict between Latinizers and Germanizers often has nationalist motives behind it. Scottish nationalists insist on the superiority of the Lowland Scots, and socialists whose nationalism takes the form of the hatred tirade against the BBC accent and even the broad A. One could multiply instances. Nationalist often gives the impression of being tinged by belief in sympathetic magic, a belief which probably comes out of the widespread custom of burning political enemies in effigy or using pictures of them as targets in shooting galleries. Instability. The intensity with which they are held does not prevent nationalist loyalties from being transferable. To begin with, as I have pointed out already, they can be and often are fastened upon some foreign country. One quite commonly finds that great national leaders or the founders of nationalist movements do not even belong to the country they have glorified. Sometimes they are outright foreigners. More often, they come from peripheral areas where nationality is doubtful. Examples are Hitler, Napoleon, de Valera, Disraeli, Poincare, Beaverbrook. The pan-German movement was in part the creation of an Englishman, Houston Chamberlain. For the past 50 or 100 years, transferred nationalism has been a common phenomenon among literary intellectuals. With Lafcadio Hearn, the transference was to Japan. With Carlyle and many others of his time, to Germany. And in our own age, it is usually to Russia. But the peculiarly interesting fact is that retransference is also possible. A country or other unit which has been worshipped for years may suddenly become detestable, and some other object of affection may take its place with almost no interval. In the first version of H.G. Wells' Outline of History and others of his writings about that time, one finds the United States praised almost as extravagantly as Russia is praised by communists today. Yet, within a few years, this uncritical admiration had turned into hostility. The bigoted communist who changes in a space of weeks or even days into a equally bigoted Trotskyist is a common spectacle. In continental Europe, fascist movements were largely recruited from among communists, and the opposite process may well happen within the next few years. What remains constant is the nationalist is his own state of mind. The object of his feelings is changeable and may be imaginary. But for an intellectual, transference has an important function, which I have already mentioned shortly in connecting with Chesterton. It makes it possible for him to be much more nationalistic, more vulgar, more silly, more malignant, more dishonest than he could have ever be on behalf of his native country, or any unit of which he had real knowledge. When one sees this lavish or boastful rubbish that is written about Stalin, the Red Army, etc., by fairly intelligent and sensitive people, one realizes that this is only possible because some kind of dislocation has taken place. In societies such as ours, it is unusual for anyone describable as an intellectual to feel a very deep attachment to his own country. Public opinion, that is, the section of public opinion of which he as an intellectual is aware, will not allow him to do so. Most of the people surrounding him are skeptical and disaffected, and he may adopt the same attitude from imitativeness, or a sheer cowardice. In that case, he will have abandoned the form of nationalism that lies nearest to hand without getting any closer to a genuinely internationalist outlook. He feels the need for a fatherland, and it is natural to look for one somewhere abroad. Having found it, he can wallow unrestrainedly in exactly what those emotions from which he believes that he has emancipated himself. God, the king, the empire, the Union Jack, all the overthrown idols can reappear under different names, and because they are not recognized for what they are, they can be worshipped without a good conscience. Transferred nationalism, like the use of scapegoats, is a way of attaining salvation without altering one's conduct. Indifference to reality. All nationalists have the power of not seeing resemblances between similar sets of facts. A British Tory will defend self-determination in Europe and oppose it in India with no feeling of inconsistent actions are held to be good or bad, not on their own merits, but according to who does them. There is almost no kind of outrage, torture, the use of hostages, forced labor, mass deportations, imprisonment without trial, forgery, assassination, the bombings of civilians, which does not change its moral color, when it is committed by our side. The Liberal News Chronicle published, as an example of shocking barbarity, photographs of Russians hanged by the Germans, and then a year or two later published with warm approval almost exactly similar photographs of Germans hanged by the Russians. It is the same with historical events. History is thought of largely in nationalist terms, and such things as the Inquisition, the tortures of the Star Chamber, the exploits of the English buccaneers, Sir Francis Drake, for instance, who was given to sinking Spanish prisoners alive, the Reign of Terror, the heroes of the mutiny blowing hundreds of Indians from the guns, or Cromwell's soldiers slashing Irish women's faces with razors, become morally neutral or even meritorious when it is felt that they were done in the right cause. If one looks back over the past quarter of a century, one finds that there was hardly a single year when atrocity stories were not being reported from some part of the world. Yet, in not one single case were these atrocities in Spain, Russia, China, Hungary, Mexico, Amritsar, Smyrna, believed in and disapproved of by the English intelligentsia as a whole. Whether such deeds were reprehensible or even whether they happened was always decided according to the political predilection. The nationalist not only does not disapprove of atrocities committed by his own side, but he has a remarkable capacity for not even hearing about them. For quite 6 years, the English admirers of Hitler contrived not to learn of the existence of Dachau and Buchenwald, and those who are loudest in denouncing the German concentration camps are often quite unaware or only very dimly aware that there are also concentration camps in Russia. Huge events like the Ukraine famine of 1933, involving the deaths of millions of people, have actually escaped the attention of the majority of English Russophiles. Many English people have heard almost nothing about the extermination of German and Polish Jews during the present war. Their own anti-Semitism has caused this vast crime to bounce off their consciousness. In nationalist thought, there are facts which are both true and untrue, known and unknown. A known fact may be so unbearable that it is habitually pushed aside and not allowed to enter into logical processes. Or, on the other hand, it may enter into every calculation and yet never be admitted as a fact, even in one's own mind. Every nationalist is haunted by the belief that the past can be altered. He spends part of his time in a fantasy world in which things happen as they should, in which, for example, the Spanish Armada was a success or the Russian Revolution was crushed in 1918. And he will transfer fragments of this world into history books whenever possible. Much of the propagandist writings of our time amounts to plain forgery. Material facts are suppressed, dates altered, quotations removed from their context, and doctored so as to change their meaning. Events which it is felt ought not to have happened are left unmentioned and ultimately denied. In 1927, Chiang Kai shek boiled hundreds of communists alive, and yet within 10 years he had become one of the heroes of the left. The realignment of world politics had brought him into the anti-fascist camp, and it was felt that the boiling of communists didn't count, or perhaps had not happened. The primary aim of propaganda is, of course, to influence contemporary opinion, but those who rewrite history do probably believe with part of their minds that they are actually thrusting facts into the past. When one considers the elaborate forgeries that have been committed in order to show that Trotsky did not play a valuable part in the Russian Civil War, it is difficult to feel that people responsible are merely lying. More probably, they feel that their own version was what happened in the sight of God. That one is justified in rearranging the records accordingly. Indifference to objective truth is encouraged by the sealing off of one part of the world from another, which makes it harder and harder to discover what is actually happening. There can often be a genuine doubt about the most enormous events. For example, it is impossible to calculate within millions, perhaps even tens of millions, the number of deaths caused by the present war. The calamities that are constantly being reported, battles, massacres, famines, revolutions, tend to inspire average person a feeling of unreality. One has no way of verifying the facts. One is not even fully certain that they have happened. And one is always presented with totally different interpretation from different sources. What were the rights and wrongs of the Warsaw Rising of August 1944? Is it true about the German gas ovens in Poland? Who is really to blame for the Bengal famine? Probably the truth is discoverable, but the facts will be so dishonestly set forth in almost any newspaper that the ordinary reader can be forgiven either for swallowing the lies or failing to form an opinion. The general uncertainty as to what is really happening makes it easier to cling to lunatic beliefs. Since nothing is ever quite provoked or proved or disproved, the most unmistakable fact can be impudently denied. Moreover, although endlessly brooding on power, victory, defeat, revenge, the nationalist is often somewhat uninterested in what happens in the real world. What he wants is to feel that his own unit is getting better of some sort of other unit, right or left. We know how the fight goes. And he can more easily do this by scoring off an adversary than by examining the facts to see whether they support him. All nationalist controversy is at the debating society level. It is always entirely inconclusive, since each contestant invariably believes himself to have won the victory. Some nationalists are not far from schizophrenia, living quite happily amid dreams of power and conquest, which have no connection with the physical world. Okay, we're going to stop it there, and we will do lives on the rest of the other half of this. I kind of got more into this than I wanted to, but I get excited reading Orwell. So I hope you enjoy watching, and we'll tune in for the live on this. Thank y'all.